All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on defensible architecture and asset management for electric utility cybersecurity. This is the fifth webinar in our 10-part series on cybersecurity and digitalization with a focus on supply chain cybersecurity in the energy sector. I am Scott Morgan, Principal Consultant with Enernex, and I will help moderate today's webinar. So thank you all for joining us. As you've probably heard the announcement, please note this webinar is being recorded. All participants have been muted. The recording will be made available after the webinar, along with a PDF of the presentation slides. So during the presentation, we'll be taking questions via the Q&A window. So you should see a button for that at the bottom of the screen. And we'll have time for Q&A after the presentation. So if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into that Q&A window. And please note, these are only shared with presenters and hosts. And finally, if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we will try to follow up with you after the presentation and provide answers. So just to note, today's event is organized through the U.S. Energy Association's Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships AMP-UP program. The AMP-UP program is funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And as I mentioned a moment ago, today's webinar is part of a 10-part series. The overarching goal of this series is to discuss the cybersecurity challenges associated with the expanding supply chain necessary to face multiple transformations in the energy sector, including integration of renewables, deployment of grid edge technologies, integration of regional markets, etc. So today's webinar, though, we will hear from Marcus Muller of Dragos Inc. and Jason Shea from Southern California Edison, who has stepped up for Brian Foster, you may have seen in the earlier announcements. So Marcus is a principal industrial consultant at Dragos and serves as the primary subject matter expert with customers to perform architecture assessments, network vulnerability assessments, consequence-driven modeling, etc., of their industrial environment. Jason Shea is a senior cybersecurity manager responsible for IT/OT security architecture at Southern California Edison. He has over 25 years of utility experience and currently sits as the DAM sector cybersecurity co-chair. He's focused on securing the nation's critical infrastructure in the utility sector as we interconnect the grid in new and exciting ways that it has never been connected before. So I think perfect speaker for this series today. Before I turn it over to them, one final reminder to our audience, please enter those questions through the Q&A window. And if we don't answer them along the way, we'll have time after the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Marcus and Jason. So please take it away.
Perfect. So today we're going to be talking about defensible architecture. But most of us are really used to dealing with developing architectures based on reference architectures, based on, best practices. And this works most of the time. I mean, I've spent my entire career securing, different industries, a lot of water utilities, renewable power generation, electric grids, gas pipelines. And during that time, for the most part, I thought I knew what was the right architecture to put in place. I use these reference architectures. I use kind of things that were out there to build these environments. And most of the time, I got it right. I put the right technology, people, and processes in place to really stop attacks from impacting production. But not always. And over the last few years, I've started to think about why this approach didn't always work. What didn't work with the approach? And this was really brought into focus more when I started working and doing consulting with Dragos, because I deal with a whole bunch of different customers across a wide range of industries, and I see them all facing the same challenge. Using those best practices or following standard guidance can be a start, but it's not really the whole answer. And it's not always the best approach. We spend a lot on cybersecurity. Last year, we were projected to spend about $18 billion, and that's going to grow to $38 billion by 2028. And is it really protecting us more? Is spending money the answer? Is deploying that new technology the answer? Well, Dragos just released this week, actually, their latest year in review. And in that year in review, there were 10 active groups, 21 total threat groups tracked, and 3 new ones this year. And on the ransomware side, we saw a 50% increase in ransomware attacks targeting industrial customers. And this type of growth seems to indicate that a lot of the stuff we're doing is not necessarily working. So maybe there's a better approach. And in my journey to understand this, the concept of defensible architecture kept coming up again and again. And there has been a lot written about it. The two papers that I think are the best are the one from Scott and Michael from Lockheed Martin about defensible architecture, and Tim Conway and Rob Lee's SANS Five Critical Controls. Both of these talk about kind of an intelligence-driven approach to the problem, figuring out what threats you have and then addressing those. And when we look at an intelligence-driven approach, I kind of can lay it out here for you a bit. In an OT context, the most important thing is to understand how the industrial processes work that you're trying to protect. This includes understanding the critical systems, how they operate, and what happens when they fail. This does take a bit of that engineering hat and looking at, how things work, but it does add a lot of value, understanding what you protect. Personally, when I'm doing this, I follow what's called a crown jewel analysis, or a CJA. A crown jewel analysis is a system and system approach of trying to figure out what the most critical components are and possible attack paths through it. Next, we need to understand what threats there are, the threat scenarios that are likely to impact our environment. A large utility such as the one that Jason works for is going to have a much different threat profile than a small water utility. We'll kind of see some examples of that during this talk. And basing, that on intel and consequence driven, we can start to understand what we need to protect that industrial process from. We also need to operate. We don't operate in a bubble. We need to operate in the real world. And there's going to be operational constraints, and there's also going to be business constraints. And those are going to drive how we can design and what we can do. Finally, we need to understand what capabilities we have. I've seen a ton of organizations deploy centralized logging that does nothing other than fill up, logs and fill up email boxes, but nobody actions it because they really don't have the capabilities to do it. And so making sure that you're designing an architecture and making it defensible based on what capabilities you have is critical. So let's take it from the academic. I've showed you the process, but let's put that into practice. So in this case, our case study is Acme. It's a fictitious amalgamation of a whole bunch of utilities I've worked with, firms I've worked with in the past. And we're going to follow Acme as it grows from a small water utility all the way up to a larger utility. And larger is a relative term here, still size-wise. So Acme, small water utility, serves about 6,000 customers. It's got 7 wells, a couple water tanks, a single treatment plant, and a couple lift stations. And wastewater type utility. Pretty standard business stack, O365, mostly cloud native. They're using a cloud customer information system, CIS. And then on the OT side, it's pretty standard. They're using Rockwell PLCs, Ignition, which is an induction automation platform for their plant. And they're using a Badger meter system. And it's an AMR, so they can drive by and read through it. So pretty standard utility. And they've operated for a while, but they do have some growth. The town's growing, and they also want to grow. They've got some good leadership, and they want to kind of grow the utility also. Unfortunately, they've had a cyber event. Business user clicked on a phishing email, which resulted in some downloaded malware. It affected about 20 of their computers, and it did impact 2 production systems, 2 OT systems. It impacted their metering system, which was probably the most impactful when you look at it from a business perspective. They were unable to bill customers, and they actually lost revenue over this because they couldn't go back and figure out billing. And so this resulted in kind of an impact financially. The other side, though, is that it impacted their engineering station. The engineering computer that they were, had all their programming on, that got impacted. And they weren't able to restore these. They didn't really have good backups. There was stuff local on these machines, and they kind of weren't considering kind of the impact. They'd done some cybersecurity, but it was all on the business side. This was a wake-up call for them, and they kind of management bought in. They hired somebody who kind of knew what they were doing, and they started this process. And they started with that crown jewel analysis. They looked at their system from an engineering standpoint and from how they would operate, And they looked at it and they figured out that the well one, tank one site was their critical water supply. It accounted for the majority of their water. And if it was offline, they actually wouldn't probably be able to meet the system well. Similarly, their water treatment plant was critical for them because they needed to treat the water before they were able to dump it without taking fines or causing an environmental issue. And they only had one. And the ability to store affluent before the treatment plant was very limited. They looked at what threats they had. So for them, opportunistic ransomware, they weren't a large target, but opportunistic ransomware, large campaigns that made, widespread campaigns were really what they were worried about. And they had some major constraints. They had a limited budget, limited staff, and infrequent production outages. So here's some things they did. First thing, they knew they couldn't just stand up brand new infrastructure to run OT. They needed to use shared infrastructure. But they did want to logically separate IT and OT. So they did that. They actually removed all the OT systems from the domain they had, which is kind of a lot for a lot of folks to step back, but they realized they couldn't manage two domains with the resources they had. So they kind of went to work group computers on the OT side. But they did separate the networks, different firewall rules, different zones on the firewall. They stood up an OTDMZ, which is, and focused on that remote access and any data movement between the OT and IT world. They wanted to secure that, make sure that everything ran through the DMZ. They also started creating an asset inventory, understanding what systems were in their environment, kind of getting that together, working with their engineer and their operators to do that. They started doing some system hardening, created a password vault, created role-based access, admin, operator, and read-only levels. They understood that if the attack had been worse, they wouldn't have been able to recover, or operations could have been easily impacted. So they really wanted to make sure that they had backups of all the critical stuff. Part of that is they deployed Rockwell's Factory Talk because they were running Rockwell PLCs. So this allowed them to back up and manage those PLCs easily. They also deployed MFA on the OT remote access and on the admin accounts. And this was really critical because they understood with shared infrastructure, if their business side was impacted, if they didn't have MFA, it would be an easier jump for an adversary to kind of impact their total infrastructure. And they really focused on backup. In OT, that meant a local NAS network attached storage and then some offline removable disks so that they knew they had backups that were immutable. And all that's great, but it's not a defensible architecture. What makes a defensible architecture is the people and the processes around it. And when it came to that, they wanted to start doing some monitoring. They knew they didn't have a ton of staff, but they wanted to have security alerts that really mattered. So they started building security use cases. They did some centralized monitoring through a SIEM, but they would log a lot of stuff to the SIEM, but they would only alert on things that they were going to action. They didn't want an email going into an email box that wasn't somebody taking an action. So they started really collecting that and building those out. They used a collection management framework or a CMF to kind of categorize everything so they had a good view. And they started developing playbooks. The first one they developed is how can we disconnect IT and OT? How can we sever the connection during an attack or during an event so that we know that OT is secure and we can continue to provide safe water for folks? How do we restore OT? And then finally, a ransomware playbooks, writing down exactly what they would do, the decisions they would make. On the Intel side, they joined an ISAC. Super important, and they started getting some visibility on what was out there. They also joined Dragos's OT Cert. It's a free resource similar to an ISAC, which shares information for smaller entities. And they started workforce training. And this training was kind of on both sides. They wanted their engineers and those operators to have some cybersecurity understanding. So they started doing some training. And then on the IT side, they started making sure that folks understood operational technology, understood industrial processes, building those bridges between the technology side of the house and the process side of the house. They ran their first tabletop exercise just to see how they would respond and start to get those lessons learned. And they tested restores. And this was, they found a lot of issues through this process. So Luckily, they didn't have another attack and they were able to grow to kind of that medium size in this case. And that medium size for them was joining up and kind of merging with an small electric utility that had been serving the town. They grew to about 9,000 customers, four distribution substations with some sub-transmission lines and some distribution lines. And their technology stack changed a little bit. On the business side, still very focused on the cloud. They kind of knew that that was the way the direction was going. Their OT systems, though, they had a centralized water SCADA. And on the electric side, they had a distribution management system, and then, of course, metering. And they were starting to deal with their own communications because of the electric utility had some fiber out there, had some wireless shots. They started dealing with that communication. They were also using leased cellular and leased lines from the local telco. Again, they went through this crown jewel analysis. In this case, they kind of found that their water SCADA and their electric SCADA, those central SCADA systems, were really the big deal. That DMS and that water SCADA were the main things that they were worried about. They started being worried about not only opportunistic but targeted ransomware. Just because they're getting a little bigger, they were more of a target. There had been some emails that they'd caught and some activity that they had seen that really started to worry them that they may become a target. And they had read recent intel reports about hacktivism taking place, impacting water utilities and manufacturers aligned with some of the geopolitical things that were going on. So they were starting to worry that they may fall victim to that just if they had low-hanging fruit. And we'll talk about kind of the changes they did there. Constraints were similar still. They were still dealing with the same issues on the constraint side. So this time they were able to spend money and kind of stand up that dedicated OT infrastructure, so separate physical hardware. They also started to do some internal segmentation. Instead of just having a DMZ for OT and then one zone inside, they started to split out the zones by function. And they really started to look at that industrial process to drive that, right? What components were working together for a given industrial process, those should be grouped together. And they tried to separate things where they could. They really followed the one up, one down model. All data flows were going to go that were going to traverse security zones. We're always going to go only one zone higher, one zone lower, and try to go through the DMZ to really limit the risks to the environment. And they started to deal with a field area network and kind of setting up that field network. And at first, they were using a lot of public space stuff. It was cheap, as easy. They had some, well monitors out there. They had some, leak detection. They had some on their lift stations. They had some cameras that were public. But the intel that they were reading was that hacktivists were targeting that low-hanging fruit, right? Publicly available IPs. So that they moved to a private APN, a private cellular space. And they started also deploying some more of their own network and started thinking about their environment. They're worried about their environment. And they're trying to make plans to kind of to address that threat. And so we see that kind of here where they've developed some of that field area network a little bit more. They also started dealing with identity management. They knew that users needed to be able to operate throughout the environment, and user identification is always a challenge for most organizations. And so they started to build out that OT production environment. They didn't want users having to have 10 passwords, but they understood, the user is going to have a business password or remote access method, and then also once they're in production. And they continue to stand with that, separation of duties and separation of roles, an admin versus a operator versus a read-only account. But they did understand that need to make it usable for those users. When it came to security controls, they started to do application whitelisting, some allow listing so that it was really set for only certain applications running. They started to run EDR within their OT environment. They deployed an actual PAM, a privileged access management solution. And they continued to focus on how to recover. They understood that they may not be able to stop every attack, but they were going to be able to recover if they were attacked. So offline to tape, they were doing local and offsite replication. So really starting to get a good backup strategy in place. When it came to making it defensible, it was really down to adding a bit of visibility. So they had the firewall points and they had visibility there. They started adding an industrial visibility solution, looking at what was happening within the industrial environment. And this was mainly at their control center, at the data center, but it started to give them a bit of visibility. They started conducting hunts. So a hunt is you come up with an idea of what an adversary may be doing or based on some intel and start looking for that in their environment and codifying those hunts into new alerts, into new use cases. They started looking at developing more playbooks. So compromised credentials of playbook they came across that they wanted to develop, compromised system. And how do we do some basic forensic triage? They joined the ISAC, which is a very active community, and started looking at intel and things like that. They knew they didn't have the workforce that they needed, so they really brought in a SOC, an outside MSP to kind of help, elevate their SOC so that they could start to get some of those alerts, and the vendor would kind of triage and address the first of those. And they continue to run, and this time OT specific tabletops, site recovery drills. Became part of their commissioning process. Whenever they had a new piece of equipment that was going out, or a new plant that was being commissioned, or a new well site, for example, they would go through a recovery process and make sure they had it down before they were commissioning it. And engineering, got on board with this for them quite a bit. So we've now moved to the largest utility. Acme decided to have some generation. They had some pretty large growth when it came to the town, and they decided to get into the generation game. And they got into the generation game with solar and wind, and then also some battery storage and some distributed solar and BESS. So this was distributed behind the meter. Customers actually adding solar to their house with some battery storage. And they had to advance their systems to kind of support this. So on the water side, things stayed relatively simple. I mean, the network grew. But on the electric side, they deployed an ADMS, an advanced distribution management systems. And they also deployed an AMI metering system, so automatic metering. So all their electric meters and actually the water meters too, they had that ability to be online. They deployed, more wireless, more fiber. They started deploying their own cellular network, 5G network for some locations, and they did continue to lease some MPLS. The same process that we've talked about. They were, of course, their primary system was still water, the water SCADA, because that was the overarching system. But ADMS, that electric ADMS, was really their critical system. They're worried about ransomware. And now they started worrying about APTs, those advanced persistent threats, those targeted threat groups that may be targeting, electric utilities in a given region. They also started worrying constraint-wise about regulatory oversight. They were getting big enough that the state regulator was starting to ask questions, and federal regulators were going to ask questions eventually too. And so they knew this was going to start to be a constraint for them. When they looked at network segmentation, they really started to go, hey, can we take it a step further? They thought about site and path resilience, deploying technologies like SD-WAN to allow them to talk between their primary site and their backup site over multiple paths. And they started looking at how they could do microsegmentation. So going beyond, hey, I'm going to have all my ADMS servers in one zone. And they started dealing with containers also. The field area network also increased. They went to that SDN model, SD-WAN model, where all of the endpoints kind of had some access rules, where the traffic was controlled across their network. They continued to connect more and more devices. And some of the devices they connected were less trusted because of the kind of the method that on the generation side that they were dealing with, they didn't always control the other side of that connection. So they knew they were connecting things to their environment and they needed to do it in a secure way. When it came to identity management, they needed to make accessing their DMZ easier. Their operators, they had more folks in, engineers, and they needed to make it so that their operators could access the read-only versions or the remote access versions of the environment a little easier. And so they actually went with an Azure model for that, with federated B2B trust connections, and really allowed the DMZ access in to that part of the environment. They continue to stay with a very separate operational technology identity domain, but they did kind of go to a resource domain model. And this is very common to kind of separate the resources out from the accounts and doing a kind of a selective trust so you can tightly control who has access to what. And when it looked at security controls, they really went to elevate the majority of the security controls. So they went, they codified an asset management program. They codified a change management program. They started doing baseline tracking. They looked at a risk-based vulnerability program, understanding that patching within these environments is not always the answer. Addressing the vulnerability is. They looked at port security, so really locking down those environments, and developed a hunt and forensics program. And again, focusing on backups, making sure that they could ride through an event. So they really focused on having standby systems, having backup systems ready to go for those critical things they found in the crown jewels, and making it defensible through monitoring. So they expanded their visibility within the OT environment to really to more sites, to more critical sites, and really understood that more traffic was going to be coming in. They also added more logging, both at a system and at a device level. They added some playbooks, insider threat and defensible cyber stance, how they were going to operate through an attack. And they started to become active. They started providing intel to the community through those EISACs and through the water ISAC, and really trying to help the community. They partnered with a couple other utilities in their area and started sharing information, and this became critical. And when it came to their workforce, they were able to develop their own SOC. They still had the MSSP doing kind of that triage for them, but their level 2 plus SOC was developed. And they started having dedicated responders. They started running tabletops that were larger, focused towards leadership, focused towards engineering, focused towards operators. And they did a system-wide recovery drill. So how do we stand up from ground zero? So this really led Acme to kind of the point where they are today, where they're, an electric utility with water generation, wastewater, and they have a pretty good defensible architecture. So in summary, this process of looking at your industrial processes, understanding your threats, operating within your constraints and capability and developing for your capabilities results in having a defensible architecture. And it sounds very easy, but at the end of the day, this is still deploying, people, technology, and processes in a right way. Understanding how the business functions is critical. This understanding the intel that's out there and then deploying the correct technology, people, and processes really will help protect you. And developing that resilience is key part of that. And enabling, and supporting the defenders, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to deal with the events when they happen. Jason, over to you on some
Yeah.
comments.
Thanks, Marcus. What I love about this presentation is, man, I wish it was true. If I could grow from small to large, I think some key points here are, a lot of us we've inherited networks that are decades in the making, and AD groups that have, been around for a while. Environments, we got legacy, modernization coming. But what I love about this presentation is you can use it to look at it and say, what can I do now, or where am I at in the journey? You want to try to shift stuff left, and I'm gonna focus on community, because when you join an iStack, the typical new member is a consumer, and the whole point of an ISAC is to be a giver. So feed the membership and the other members, and be collaborative as early on as you can. When you start building playbooks, or if you're well on your path to playbooks, make sure that you practice them and practice often. When you're establishing relationships and cross training between cybersecurity analysts, engineers, or architects, and OT engineers and architects, maintain those relationships. Go to lunch with them. Be a face, be a voice. Preferably, you can be a member of the solution design councils or strategies. You really want to align so the business understands and institute a collaborative risk framework where the business understands the risk and the level of risk and what happens. And then one of the things is we evolve and modernize the grid and put all kinds of technologies on it. We are interconnecting the grid in ways that we never have before. So as you're doing crown jewel analysis, it's important to what we call tiering the system. No critical path. There's a national security element with critical defense facilities. As utilities, we have, emergency response facilities, industrial sites, ports, financial institutions, supermarkets, and knowing, that path, where the power flow is, and how to build resiliency beyond just kind of natural disasters. But cyber resiliency is becoming more important now than it ever has. And we need to figure out, from building these relationships and playbooks, how do we maintain operations, critical path during a compromise? We've kind of, could be controversial, but we have to get rid of the zero breach mentality and establish with the business, how do we maintain operations if you lose ADMS, or God forbid they get to your EMS? It's really important beyond backup and recovery, but having that, how do we keep the lights on and the power flowing, and stabilize availability when someone, an attacker is trying to disrupt our ability to do so. So just some of the other things from, I think it's important from a community perspective that IOUs, co-ops, munis, that we, we're in this together. If something happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. It's important that we communicate with those that are part of the interconnected grid and those that we rely on. We just hosted, post-COVID quarantine, finally, we were able to host our first California joint utility security summit. We had PG&E, Sempra, SMUD, LAW, DWP, and SCE. And we just, had similar talks like this and covered different, from regulatory to zero trust to defensible architecture. And, really were able to talk freely in a trusted zone and figure out kind of further talks. What can we do? How can we do more? We don't all have the same level of budgets or resource availability, but let's lean in and figure out. And I'm going to give a plug to Dragos with Neighborhood Keeper, and being able to have a collective defense strategy and, request assistance. The other piece that I, really encourage is to establish early on relationships with the federal government. I'm a key, opponent. Like, nobody knows your system as well as you do. Nobody's going to come in and save your system because they don't know it as well as you do, but they can help. So, local FBI, agency.
Looks like Jason might have frozen. So Jason, if you're still talking, we're not hearing you. Or I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, I'm not either.
Okay.
I think to Jason's point though, it is really critical. So before Dragos, I worked for a multinational utility based out of Canada, but we had mostly North American operations, but some international. And regardless of what region you're in, developing those relationships with not only with the community is super important because you're gonna learn a lot from it, but from others, but you're also going to be able to help each other out and build that community. And collective defense is very hard, but there's some really good value to it. And then on the government side, regardless, in the US, we're really lucky that the US government puts a lot of energy into and a lot of time and effort into making sure that the critical infrastructure is secure. And regions like Europe and Asia are definitely coming along nicely on that too. But if you're in other regions, try to build those relationships with government too. You do want to do that ahead of time. I've been involved sometimes, you have an incident and the government comes in, you're dealing with law enforcement, you're dealing with, however, and you want to have those relationships ahead of time so you kind of know how that's going to function. And to Jason's point about community defense, Dragos just published the year in review. In that report, we talk about some of the benefits of community defense. Neighborhood Keeper is an example of that. It's a program that kind of adds visibility to the entire community. And it's involved, there's a bunch of EISACs or ISACs involved in that and really allowing that community defense because you do need that visibility across the community.
Yeah. Actually, a couple notes I was looking up while you're talking. So, the EISAC is North America focused,
Yeah.
but I imagine there are similar ones. I was surprised to learn the Water ISAC allows utilities in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and UK, and the Netherlands. So, these organizations might not be as narrowly focused as you expect, and there may be opportunity to join if depending on where you are. I guess the other thing you mentioned in there was around some of the resources. I guess I wanted to confirm is, OT Cert has resources that are available internationally, although there are some parts of the program that are just North America. Is that true? Or?
Yep. Yeah, I believe so I've worked a lot on the North America stuff. We do have international folks. And there is some restrictions around it just because of the restrictions, set forth. But yeah, it's the idea behind that is a free resource that you apply for it, and there's a whole lot of things in there. I did, for example, a couple of years ago, yeah, almost a couple of years ago, I did a TTX workshop, and all the material from that workshop is on OT Cert. So there's playbooks, there's how to conduct things. The idea is really to help those the the Edisons of the world, that Jason works for. They have a ton of resources. We're always here to help them, and as a vendor, we definitely want to do that, but that doesn't help us. It doesn't help I'm on a 400 person water utility here at my house. There's two people working there. I know I talked to them about cybersecurity, funny enough, but I need clean water. And so, and we all need those critical resources, just to live. And so making sure that there's resources available for that. And there's a ton of them out there. OT Cert from Dragos is one. There's also Community Defense, which was launched by Dragos. That's a good resource. I work for Dragos, so I know those. But there's also a ton of other ones, resources from the U.S. government, from y'all. But there's also SANS has a bunch of stuff out there. There's a ton of stuff out there, and I would definitely encourage anybody to reach out and try to, if you need a list or, the community is growing, and there's a good community now, and folks that want to help folks. So definitely try to make those connections.
Yeah, and there was a question in the chat about sort of when will this where are the recordings for these webinars. So they will be available through the USEA website. But I also want to bring this up because we're going to develop a written summary of all the webinars. And within that, we will definitely include links to a lot of those places to get resources like SINs, like Dragos OT-Cert. That will take longer than looking at the recording, but that should be available. So I saw we had Jason back. Welcome. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know where you lost me, but I actually have a list of the top 10 kind of threat intel feeds that are freely available. You just got it like virus totals on the list. I can share that after. You just got to be careful because whatever you share with the list gets populated with everything. So you don't want to overshare with the free threat intel feeds, but
Right. Actually, maybe I can use that as a segue into one of the questions I had. I think, Marcus, you talked about sort of aligning that threat intel with, or aligning your architecture with sort of your capabilities. And so, one of those will be sort of also how you bring in that threat intel. Can you, talk a little bit more about, kind of how you do that and sort of how you get over maybe a fear that you're going to miss something if you're only sort of logging in certain places or creating alerts that are sort of aligned to things that you can do.
Yeah, so kind of the intel piece. So I mean the ingestion of intel can be a full-time job. I follow this stuff quite closely and I get the benefit of reading our worldview reports every day. And I probably spend half an hour every day reading worldview reports. Um, I'm super involved in it, but I think if you're not as, if you don't have as much time, I think even having somebody spend an hour a week on a team, or yourself reading kind of what's happening trend wise, subscribing to a couple, ISACs or a couple feeds, and Jason has that list. Like there's some easy resources and just looking at kind of emerging threats. So I kind of mentioned hacktivists, right? OT hasn't really been targeted by hacktivists until this year. I mean, there's been some small stuff in the past, but like this year, hacktivists impacted with Cyber Avengers for in the US and the UK, and then some attacks that happened in Russia and Iran and Ukraine. Like those are events that we really haven't had to consider in the past, and just tracking something like that and having an understanding. And for example, with Cyber Avengers, it was the Unisys PLCs, right? If I see that intel, the first thing I'm going to do as an organization is go, hey, do I have an asset inventory that I can go look at? Do I have any of these PLCs? Right? Maybe having a quick conversation with engineering and going, you know, do you guys deploy these at all? Talk to your engineers. They know. Um, and the thing about engineers that I've learned over my career is like engineers love figuring out ways to do stuff easier, better, faster, all the things. And so maybe that an engineer deployed one of these and you kind of, in the shadow IT world, they kind of deployed it without you knowing. Maybe it's, just monitoring system. They don't think it's important, that type of a thing. So you do want to have those conversations and have some good asset inventory. When it comes to monitoring, I try to look at those critical systems is really driven by that crown jewels approach, right? So if I'm monitoring one, like in our example, if we're monitoring one area of that largest utility, it's going to be that core ADMS system around that core system. Maybe if I get advanced enough, and kind of develop my framework around monitoring enough, I may add some visibility or add some additional monitoring on within the critical substations. Um, I'm a huge fan of only having alerts that people action. When I ran a team, that was our motto. Like we don't fire an alert. Doesn't mean we're not logging. There's a big difference between alerting and logging, and people sometimes get that confused. But like we wouldn't fire an alert unless somebody was going to go do something about it. Now we also performed hunts, and hunts were, hey, go look at all the data we have a hypothesis and test it. And a lot of times our hunts became alerts. We wanted to to turn a hunt into an alert at the end a lot of times. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and can I add on that
Yeah.
too? Idaho National Labs has a good, and it's free, CIE, so Cyber Informed Engineering Implementation Guide. You can, implementation guide being the key word. So it's hard, or at least harder, to look at the existing and try to come up with defensible architecture and patching and all the things. It could quickly become overwhelming. But we have to remember that, it's a lot easier, and we have good opportunities to target what's coming in the door, and hit it before the implementation, and establish those secure by design strategies. I'm going to try not to get on my soapbox here because I do it a lot, but vendors have to be held accountable, especially critical infrastructure vendors that are putting stuff on the market in our environments must be held accountable. And as IOUs or asset owners, we have to, have a firm set of requirements that we hold them to. And then the federal government could put some, really strong regulations in place. And I'm talking hold them to a higher standard because this is critical infrastructure. It's not email. And they have to put, get rid of insecure by design practices. And, we can work together on these new solutions. We got to get creative, stay innovative, and figure out ways to kind of put that secure by design practice without massive overhead or cost. So, but I highly recommend just reading through that CIE implementation guide, because that really is taking. So if you take what the business is doing, or say vehicle electrification, and you look at, what, just get some HBOM information and look at it, and now go to your threat intelligence side and say, what's out there for this? What kind of, attack or threat landscape exists? Or you could have known CVEs, or you could have actual known TTPs, IOCs that would help you establish, like, how am I going to defend this thing? And then again, it goes back to operating it during compromise. How am I going to operate without it? If I lose this, capability or set of assets, it could be a solar bank, it could be a battery bank, whatever it is. But how do I operate and maintain stability if I lose, that resource? It's kind of changing your mindset to defend everything into, establishing that what if scenario, and then using real threat intelligence to say, like, real world attacks, what can I learn from this? What kind of protections can I put in place? How can I establish these playbooks before it comes in, and I'm sitting there with the business, right? And integrating solution designs, and then I'm taking the vendors that they're engaged with and saying, prove to me that you have a security cadence and strong, practices in place, and how do you secure your environment as well as we're trying to secure ours? Because those vendors, get compromised. We have data out there. They have customer information. So anyway, I'll stop my soapbox. I'm telling you, I can go on all
No,
day.
well, I'll let you go on a little bit more. I'm actually curious. I just wanted to kind of direct you a little bit. You mentioned the legacy issue earlier. I mean, secure by design is, I think, to a certain extent, more of a modern consideration, that a lot of
Right.
the equipment that's probably out there, they were racing to market, and security was an afterthought. Like, you have sort of specific.
They still are.
Okay. So then, I mean, not just legacy, then do you have sort of specific considerations when dealing with those legacy assets in terms of architecture?
Yeah, that goes back to, I think, early on, maybe the medium sized. I think you hit it, but that's where you get into, it's really important to on your networking side to have segmentation, zones, and more advanced firewalls that have application layer security within them. But getting down to the micro segmentation level for legacy systems, I think is key, so that you can kind of, um,
You say a bit
put
more
those
on
in a
this
protected enclave.
micro segmentation is sort of putting things on even smaller networks, or I guess just is it
Yeah, it's isolating it to a specific, so you could cut off the network within that micro segmentation. If it's compromised, you can cut that off. It's kind of what we call sever the arm to save the heart method. And then it will prevent anything from lateral or traversing elsewhere. Or in reverse, you could operate within that micro segmentation because it's clean. We know they haven't got there. There's no impact, but that's critical to our operations. Let's isolate and operate in that level. And I
Yeah,
know people don't like it, but you might have to get in a car and drive into and manually operate. That's kind of that mindset. How are we going to operate this and maintain availability during a compromise? Because we know from a cyber perspective, it's going to be coming in from an external network. We're not going to get into physical security on this, but
right, right.
and as you go down, that's kind of where that micro segmentation comes in. Using software defined networking, field area network, I think it's super important because that is a large, you know, I think we have 50,000 square miles that we support, and our field area network is going to be up on mountaintops and all over the place. So
Right. Marcus, did you want to add in there?
Yeah, I was gonna say one like micro segmentation. I highly recommend deploying, especially for those legacy or high risk assets. For example, like I've had to deal a lot of my career. I've been at generation sites and wind farms, and you've got that that odd vendor in there that you don't necessarily trust, but they're there for the wind farm, like it's part of the operation, or a third party device, for example, and segmenting the network, making sure they're separate from the rest of your environment, and making sure that sometimes that it may mean deploying an intermediate system. So at times what we would do is deploy another system into a DMZ that did nothing but was kind of the go-between, acted as a gateway, DMP3 or OPC, for example, gateways. And putting some monitoring control around what that device can do, how it can impact your system, and that's we're going to get into the nitty gritty a little bit, but for something like that, what control points it can impact. You may program on that RTAC or on that RTU, you may only have it being able to, write or control certain points versus, that more open things, engineers, power engineers, protection engineers are more used to having that open substation or that open plant where everything can talk. But yeah, that's stuff I've deployed kind of to address that issue in the past also.
one other thing I want to add,
Yeah.
just quickly touch on is Marcus brought up containers and the usage of like Kubernetes. There's a nice security opportunity there, because with containers you can recover the container as quick as it can become compromised. So obviously you don't want to just whack them all and have compromise, recover, compromise. But what you can do is secure a container and really limit um, what it can communicate with. So you can isolate that container to just pure function and put policies around it where today's older systems, control system environments are, you get in and you're it's kind of flat. You don't have a ability to protect the components and components of the system, where containerization puts it into a nice container, and you could put security around it, similar to a firewall, but not. It's just you can restrict what it can do better.
So how does all of this kind of balance? I mean, you talked about the cyber informed engineering. I mean, how is this balancing sort of the needs of operation versus doing that network segmentation? I guess I'm sort of thinking, in an emergency situation, is there a scenario where, we're having trouble getting access to this key piece of equipment, even though it should be there because, the person who has the right, uh, you know, um, or I guess maybe just the credentials to get in isn't around. Do you end up with barriers, or are you able to sort of put operations first?
I think there's certain barriers. You do need to sit down and um, you know, separate the nice to have to the must have to operate the system, and then have those for how long conversations. Um, Colonial Pipeline's a good example where you know they, there was a ransomware incident and it impacted the OT side without impacting the OT side. To my knowledge, it was cutting it off, but it created panic um, amongst the consumer side, and then it impacted the operations with the IT OT split. So we have to, within the critical infrastructure, we have to consider what that scenario looks like, and how do we isolate and operate, and if it requires people going into a central location that's on a trusted network versus, coming in from a remote location. And then what do we really need? Like, what are the minimum requirements to operate, and how long can you do it? 30, 60, 90 days. And Marcus, you might know kind of the the average, turnaround from a ransomware incident. I think it can be 60, 90 days.
Yeah. I mean, I can say I've dealt in incidents where we're dealing with 6 months after the fact and we're still dealing with cleanup and recovery. It depends on how widespread, but I think to your point, that core understanding what your core business is and what interdependencies and what functions you need to have to deliver that core business. When you start working, like when you're working through an event, there's a there's a mentality a lot of times to, just get systems back up, get systems back up. We just have to get operating. We need to get us back to normal. And that's where those playbooks and really planning stuff ahead of time is the difference a lot of times between how short and how long an event is going to impact you. And as you brought up, like, hey, having an engineer that needs to get into a piece of equipment, like thinking about some of those things ahead of time, as Jason said, they may need to get in a car, they may have to get on a plane, because the normal way they access that during an event may not be an option. It may not, you may, if it's critical, it may be something where you have an alternate method. Um, we used not a previous employer, we used to have, um, kind of emergency packs that we could stand up a clean network with, um, so that we could start to do restores if we had an issue at a site. So there were ways that we could, we thought about how to do things in a degraded state and how we were going to recover. Luckily, I never had to do it that way. So,
Yeah,
but it's
and
still nice
Or
to
did you
have
say
it.
emergency packs, like a cart of equipment kind of thing?
Yeah, shipped a
yeah,
Pelican case with kind of a like a base network to be able to start to stand up a site.
the fortunate part of the utility space is that we're a passionate community, and we're really good at um, you know emergency response. That's when we shine, right? We're used to dealing with wildfires, high wind events, hurricanes, natural disasters, flooding. I mean, we're really good at that. It's just putting that cyber lens to it as we modernize and interconnect the grid, that we got to make sure that we engage the right people at the right time with the right information to take action. And why I love that the way that Marcus presented this is that it goes from small, medium, large, and not all of us are fortunate enough to do that. We inherit a lot. But you can start to think about, how to grow your program in that way, and how to extend into those, maybe you can't add more resources, but you can engage more resources that exist that know these things and operate, or know how to activate your emergency operations center as your central hub, and how do you get, like an incident management triage team together, those kind of things that the utility space, we've been doing it for, hundreds of years. So take advantage of it, I guess.
Okay. Marcus, I guess want to get any final words? We're realizing we're at the top of the hour here.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity. Defensible architecture is definitely something I'm really passionate about, and there's a ton of resources out there. It benefits us all when we secure this stuff.
Yeah. And Jason, same?
Just, really appreciate the opportunity. I came in here to fill in for Brian. So, I appreciate the opportunity, and just really want to emphasize, just do something. If anything, don't wait around for something bad to happen. Take advantage of the free resources and things that are out there for you. And just, again, we're all in it together. So, defense is critical, and I appreciate it.
It's great note to end on. So with that, let me say, thank you for all the participants for everyone who joined us today. And yeah, special thanks again to Marcus and Jason for sharing their experience and expertise. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the recording of today's webinar will be uploaded to USCA's YouTube channel, and a link to that recording will be added to the event page, along with a PDF of the presentation slides. So next, we'll have our 6th webinar in the series in 2 weeks. So that'll be on March 7th. And on that one, we're going to speak to a couple different utilities about their experience developing a cybersecurity incident response plan. So we have an ongoing, it's a 10-part series. The webinars will continue every 2 weeks thereafter. So please be on the lookout for email announcements. And if you did miss a previous webinar, you should be able to view the recordings by finding the events on USCA's calendar or on USCA's YouTube channel. So with that, thanks again to everybody for joining today. And we hope to see you again in 2 weeks on March 7th. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.